There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being right too early. Not the loneliness of failure that one people understand. They'll pat your shoulder and buy you a drink and say, well, you tried. No, I mean the loneliness of doing something that looks, by every reasonable measure, like complete and total madness, and knowing somewhere in the marrow of your bones that you're not wrong. That loneliness is a different animal. It doesn't sit quiet. It follows you to the barn at 4 a.m. It stands in the corner while you're warming milk by lantern light, watching you with flat eyes, saying nothing. Eli Rourke knew that loneliness better than most men know their own reflections. I was 26 years old when I rode onto the Rourke property the first time, hired on as a seasonal hand by a ranching outfit 3 miles east that needed extra muscle for fence repair. I wasn't supposed to be on Eli's land at all. I ended up there because my horse threw a shoe, and because the storm that came rolling in off the mesa didn't ask permission before it arrived. I stumbled onto Eli's front porch wet and cold, and ready to apologize for the intrusion, and I found him sitting in a rocking chair with a piglet wrapped in a wool scrap across his knees, feeding it from a cloth-tipped bottle, staring at me like I was the strange one. That was October. By the time I understood what he was doing, really understood it, the snow was already 4 feet deep, and the ranchers who'd called him crazy were doing something I'd never seen grown men in this territory do in public before. They were asking him for help. What follows is what I saw, what I wrote down in my log, because I've always had this habit of writing things down when they don't make sense to me, and most of what Eli Rourke did, for a long time, did not make sense to me. I offer it here not as a story of triumph or vindication. I offer it because some things deserve to be witnessed, and the men who carry the hardest truths often do it alone and quiet, and the world has a terrible habit of only recognizing them after the moment has passed. I don't intend to let that happen with Eli. Written in the field log of Thomas Aldridge, hand laborer, age 26, October through November. The first thing you noticed about Eli Rourke was that he didn't defend himself. That sounds like a small thing. In this part of the country in that time, it was the largest thing there was. A man out here, rancher, hand, sheriff's deputy, preacher, he defended himself with words the same way he defended his fence line with wire. You questioned him, he answered back. You doubted him, he explained. That was the currency of respect between men who lived by what they built with their own hands. Eli didn't spend that currency. When Roy Fentress, who ran the biggest cattle operation in the valley and had opinions about everything from grazing rights to the temperature at which coffee ought to be served, rode up to Eli's fence line and said, loud enough for the 3 men with him to hear, I see you're still playing nursemaid to garbage. Eli looked up from the water trough he was fixing, considered Roy for a moment, and went back to the trough. Just that, no words, back to the trough. Roy waited. His horse shifted. Then Roy rode off, and one of his hands, a younger fellow named Casper, who would later that winter do something significant, glanced back over his shoulder at Eli, and I caught that glance, and what was in it was not mockery. It was something closer to confusion. Like watching a man walk into a fire and not burn. I wrote in my log that night, Rourke doesn't argue. Strange for a man who has so much to argue about. The Piglets had come to him the way most catastrophes come to the people least prepared for them, all at once, with no warning, and from a direction nobody expected. It had started 3 weeks before I arrived, with a disease moving through the smaller homestead farms along the western ridge. I pieced the story together slowly, from what I overheard and what the old Jicarea Apache man named Haspa told me one afternoon when he appeared at the edge of the property, the way he had a habit of doing, quietly, without announcement, like weather. Haspa had known Eli since Eli was a boy, and he moved through that property with the ease of someone who had walked it long before the current owner had any claim to it. He told me things in a way that was not quite storytelling and not quite instruction. He would say something and then stop and let it sit in the air between us until I understood it or didn't. What he told me about the Piglets, a sickness had moved through 8 or 9 small farm operations along the ridge in late September. Not a killing sickness, not immediately, but debilitating, attacking the sows, reducing milk production to almost nothing. The piglets, most of them less than 3 weeks old, began dying by the dozen. The farmers, practical men facing a practical catastrophe, did what practical men do. They calculated. Feed costs against survival odds. Most piglets this young, pulled from nursing mothers this sick, didn't make it. The math was ugly but clear. You cut your losses. You let the weak ones go. You save what you can of the season and you start over in spring. That was the reasonable thing. Eli had gone up to the ridge, from what Haspa told me, not because anyone asked him to. He'd gone because he'd heard about it, and because he was constitutionally incapable of hearing about a living thing in distress and not going to look at it. He'd walked among the sick sows and the failing piglets on 3 different farms, and he'd done his math too. His math came out different. He brought home 83 piglets in the back of a wagon. 3 of them died in transit. 80 survived. The farmers who gave them to him did so the way you hand someone a handful of mud and say, see what you can do with that. They were not being cruel. They genuinely did not believe the piglets would live. They thought Eli was buying himself weeks of heartbreak at best, at worst a financial hole he'd never dig out of. Most piglets this compromised, this young, this far from nursing mothers, maybe 1 in 10 survived with intensive round-the-clock care. Maybe. Eli had taken 80. His barn, when I first stumbled into it, looked like a field surgery in some war I hadn't fought. He'd built supplementary pens from scrap lumber along the south wall, where it held the most heat. He had a wood-burning box stove he dragged in from somewhere and positioned in the center of the space with careful attention to airflow. Every piglet had a wool wrap or a burlap nest depending on its size and condition. He had a system of cloth-tipped bottles. I counted 14 of them in rotation, some warming in a shallow pan of water near the stove. And he moved through the barn with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about what he was doing and had simply become it. He was mixing the milk himself. That was the first thing that surprised me. Not buying formula from the supply merchants in town, he'd gone to Haspa, I later learned, and Haspa had given him something, a knowledge that predated any of the supply catalogs by about 3 centuries. A mixture of goat's milk, rendered bone broth, and something I couldn't identify that smelled like dried grass and something sweeter, and the proportions were exact, and Eli had learned them the way Haspa taught everything in practice, not in writing, because writing made people think they understood before they did. I watched Eli feed 6 piglets in the time it took me to figure out how he was keeping track of which ones had eaten and which hadn't. He had a system of colored cord tied loosely around left ears, red for fed in the last 4 hours, no cord for due now, blue for the ones that needed watching. He moved without the cord chart, from memory, shifting his attention to each animal with a concentration that was startling in a man who, by all outward appearance, looked like he hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks. He hadn't, I later found out. He was sleeping in the barn in 2-hour intervals. You need help, I told him on the second day I was there. My horse's shoe had been fixed. There was no practical reason for me to still be on his property. I was still there because something about the barn had snagged me, the way a song does when you've only heard part of it. Eli looked at me with eyes that had the slightly glazed quality of extreme fatigue, and he said, I don't need anything from you. But you're welcome to be useful if you want. That was the longest speech I'd heard him give. I stayed. What I did not fully understand then, what I am only now, putting it into words, beginning to properly articulate, was that Eli was not attempting the piglet rescue because he thought it was economically sound. He was not doing it because he expected gratitude. He had done some private calculation that had nothing to do with money or social standing or what Roy Fentress thought about it. And the result of that calculation was that he was going to do this thing, and the opinions of others were not inputs in his equation. I found his log, he kept one too, which was part of why I warmed to him despite myself, left open on the workbench one afternoon. He wasn't trying to hide it. He just wasn't performing it either. The entry I read, dated 3 days before I arrived. Lost 2 today, one had never been strong, the other I thought was turning a corner. The second one is the kind of loss that teaches you not to get ahead of yourself. Haspa says the ones that survive will be different animals than what they would have been. Harder, not in a broken way, in a way that holds. People are going to talk about this regardless of how it ends. If they all die, they'll say I was a fool. If half of them live, they'll say it wasn't worth it. If most of them live, well, I suppose we'll see what they say then. But I know this. If I had left them on that ridge to die because the math was inconvenient, I would not have been able to look Haspa in the face. And I am not sure I'd have been able to look at my own hands without wondering what they were for. I closed the log and went back to feeding the ones with no cord. The community's response to Eli was, in that first month, a study in the particular way humans manage their discomfort with someone who refuses to perform practicality. Roy Fentress came twice more, once to reiterate in different words that Eli was wasting himself. Once, about 2 weeks later, with a man from the land office, and I didn't hear that conversation, but I heard its edges. Something about water rights and a shared easement Eli had been in dispute over for 2 seasons. That second visit, Eli stood straighter. Afterward, he came back into the barn and fed 3 piglets in a row without speaking, and I did not ask. The women from the valley who sometimes brought food to the Rourke property, Eli was widowed, had been for 4 years, and there was a loose social care network around him that he accepted without encouraging. They were divided. Some thought the piglet business was sad, a man that lonely doing something that odd to fill the quiet. One of them, a stout practical woman named Marta, whose husband had a failed piggery operation and therefore had relevant opinions, told me on the porch while I was cleaning mud off my boots. Those animals are going to die, and it's going to devastate him, and then what? He's done this before. He gets attached to things that aren't going to survive, and then he carries it. What did he get attached to before? I asked. She looked at me and then looked at the barn and said, his wife was sick a long time before she went. He stayed up nights with her for 2 years. He never once acted like it was unusual. She didn't say it like a compliment. She said it like a diagnosis. I wrote in my log, there is a kind of stubbornness that looks from the outside exactly like grief. Maybe it is grief. Maybe he's been grieving for years and nobody thought to look at what he's actually doing with it. The piglets, meanwhile, were doing something unexpected. They were not all dying. By the end of the 3rd week of my time at the Rourke place, I had sent word to the outfit I was hired for that I'd been delayed by weather, which was partially true, and was now staying on with Rourke for a small wage while I figured out what I was doing with myself, which was entirely true. Roughly 62 of the original 80 were not only surviving, but gaining weight. Some of them were gaining it fast. The mixture Haspa had taught Eli was doing something I couldn't quantify, but could see. The piglets that had come to the barn looking like collapsed paper sacks were filling out, getting loud, starting to shove each other at feeding time with the blind insistence of animals that expect to still be alive tomorrow. Eli never said anything celebratory about this. He tracked it in his log. He noted it to Haspa when the old man appeared at the fence line. He didn't mention it to anyone else because no one else was asking. The one who came closest to asking was Casper, the young hand from Roy Fentress's outfit. He turned up at Eli's fence one afternoon alone, hat in hand, with the quality of a man who has decided to do something he's been talked out of doing 3 times already. He said he'd heard the piglets were coming around. He said he thought that was good news. Eli studied him. You come to tell me Roy sent you? No, Casper said, and his jaw tightened. I came on my own. A silence. The wind off the mesa came down cold enough that I could see both their breaths. Come help with the water troughs, Eli said. They need breaking up. Casper put his horse at the fence post and came in. He worked without a word for 2 hours. Before he left, he told Eli that his mother had raised pigs back in Missouri, and that she'd kept a sow sick for 3 months before it recovered, and that people had said she was wasting good money on a dying animal the whole time. The sow had lived another 6 years. Eli said nothing to this. He handed Casper a cloth-tipped bottle and pointed at a piglet with no cord. Casper fed it without being told how. The temperature that night dropped 15 degrees. I went to sleep in Eli's spare room, listening to the wind find every gap in the walls, and I thought about the 62 piglets in the barn with their wool wraps and their bone broth milk and their colored cord systems, and I thought about Marta calling it devastation, and I thought about Eli's log entry about his hands and what they were for. Then I stopped thinking and went to sleep, because in the morning there would be more feeding, more trough breaking, more cord checking, and the animals did not care what conclusions I had reached about any of it. That was November, written in the field log of Thomas Aldridge, late November through December. The thing about Haspa was that he never explained himself, and by the time you understood why, you'd already learned whatever it was he was trying to teach you. He'd been appearing at the property 2 or 3 times a week since before I arrived, and by mid-November I'd grown accustomed enough to his presence that I no longer startled when I looked up from mending a pen wall and found him standing 5 feet away, watching the piglets with the calm, analytical attention of a man conducting a study no one had commissioned. He was maybe 60 years old. It was difficult to tell with Haspa, with hands that looked like old rope and eyes that caught light the same way still water does, deeply and from unexpected angles. He and Eli communicated in a way I initially found baffling and later found enviable. They would stand at the fence or lean against the barn wall and exchange 6 or 8 sentences over the course of half an hour, and those sentences would contain what a different pair of men would have needed an hour to say. There was no performance between them, no explaining to the other who they were. They had clearly, a long time ago, arrived at the part of a friendship where you stopped doing that. I asked Eli once, while we were both on our knees checking the underside of a pen for gaps where the cold came through, how long he'd known Haspa. "Since I was about 8, Eli said. He had a nail in his mouth and was feeling along the board with his fingertips. "How'd that start?" He took the nail out and set it between his teeth on the other side. "My father traded horses with his family. I followed one of the younger men around for 2 days when they were camped on our south pasture. He didn't tell me to go away." "And Haspa?" "Haspa told me to stop following and come walk beside him or don't come at all." He found the gap, marked it with the nail. "I walked beside him." I understood something then about Eli, why he didn't defend himself, why he didn't perform his decisions for an audience. He'd learned at 8 years old from a man who had no patience for the performance of worthiness that the thing and the explanation of the thing were not the same thing. You did not justify, you did. Then you kept doing. The piglet mortality had stabilized by the second week of November at 11 dead out of the original 80, below what any reasonable person would have projected. 69 alive, most of them thriving by any visible measure, a handful still fragile but holding. Eli had begun to transition several of the strongest to solid feeding, mash mixed with the broth, less bottle time. And those animals had an energy to them that was, honestly, slightly alarming. They had been born into difficulty and fed through difficulty, and they were loud and insistent, and they shoved against their pen walls with a cheerful imperiousness that made even Eli's mouth twitch occasionally in something that was almost a smile. I wrote in my log, the survivors are peculiar animals, not delicate, not cautious. They seem to expect the world to accommodate them, which is strange given the world's recent behavior toward them. Haspa, when I shared this observation with him, I had begun sharing things with him because he had begun, occasionally, looking at me directly, which I'd come to understand was his version of an invitation, said, "Animals that are kept alive through difficulty develop an unusual relationship with mortality. They do not fear it in the same way. They have already been very close to it and have not become it." I wasn't sure if he was talking about the piglets. He looked at me and then at Eli, who was across the barn doing something with the stove. He was not talking about the piglets. The community's attitude during this period was shifting in the subtle, reluctant way that attitudes shift when reality begins to contradict the story people have been telling. Roy Fentress had stopped riding by. Whether that was because the land office business had been settled or because he'd run out of things to say, I didn't know. Marta came with a pot of stew and asked, with studied casualness, how the animals were keeping. The 3 younger farmers who'd given Eli their failing piglets, men named Garvey, Peck, and a fellow everyone called Two Hat for reasons I never established, had shown up on separate occasions and stood at the fence and watched for a while without saying much. Two Hat had said to Eli the second time he came, "I thought they'd all be dead by now." Eli said 14 are. Two Hat said, "What about the rest?" 69, Eli said. Two Hat chewed on that number for a long moment. "That's most of them." "Yes," Eli said. "Huh," Two Hat said, and then walked back to his horse, and that was that. I found this exchange remarkable. Eli had not said "I told you so," had not said yes, and everyone thought I was a fool, had not said anything at all that leveraged the moment. He answered the questions and let the answers be what they were. I asked him about it later, when we were in the barn for the last feeding of the evening. "Two Hat gave me those animals," Eli said. He was unwinding a cord from a pen latch. "He couldn't afford to keep them alive himself, and he gave them to me instead of letting them go in the field. That's not nothing." "He didn't think you'd manage it." "No, but he gave them anyway." Eli looked at the cord in his hands. "People do what they can manage. Sometimes that's more than they think it is, and sometimes it's less. Pointing it out doesn't help much either way." I wrote that down verbatim in my log that night. What I hadn't written down yet, because I was still working out how to describe it. was the one moment I'd witnessed between Eli and Haspa that had shaken me more than anything else on that property. It had happened 2 weeks earlier in the hour before dawn, when I'd gotten up to use the outhouse and heard something from the barn that didn't sound right. A low, cycling sound, not quite crying, not quite anything I had a name for. I went to the barn door and pushed it open slowly, and what I saw was Eli sitting on the floor in the center of the barn with a piglet in his lap that I recognized. The one he'd spent the most time with, the smallest of the first batch, a runt he'd named, which I'd pretended not to notice because the naming of animals you might lose is an intimacy I didn't want to comment on. He called it Nail, for the nail it had swallowed when it was 3 weeks old and passed without obvious consequence, which Eli had called a miracle and Haspa had called predictable. Nail was in his lap and not moving correctly. I could see it from the door. Haspa was already in the barn. I didn't know how he'd gotten there or when or how he'd known. He was sitting against the wall a few feet from Eli, not touching him, not speaking, just present in that way he had, as if presence itself were an act, something you did deliberately rather than arrived at by default. Eli was talking to the piglet. Low, quiet, not in any language I recognized at first, and then I realized it wasn't a language at all. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they're past language, when the words would only be in the way. He was making the sound without embarrassment and without performance. He wasn't doing it for Haspa, and he wasn't doing it for himself in any calculated sense. He was just there with the animal, in the last of whatever time it had. Nail died about 20 minutes later. I know because I stayed at the door that whole time, which I am not sure I should have done, but I couldn't make myself leave. When it was over, Eli sat still for a while. Then he put the piglet down gently, in a piece of clean burlap he'd had beside him, and he folded the burlap corners over it with the precise care of someone wrapping something that was going to matter later even though it wouldn't. And then he stood up, and he went to the next piglet in the row, the one with the red cord, and he checked its cord, and he moved on. Haspa said to the air more than to Eli, "You did what could be done." Eli didn't answer, but something in his shoulders changed, some fraction of a degree, the way a wall shifts when one plank settles fully into another. And that fraction was all the acknowledgement that passed between them, and it was enough, and they both knew it was enough, and I at the door understood something that I put in my log like this. Some people love things the way they keep accounts, always knowing the balance, always aware of what they might lose. Eli doesn't do it that way. He loves things the way you breathe, without deciding to, without keeping track, which means when something is gone, it's just gone, and he doesn't have a ledger to point to that makes it add up. I don't know if that's braver or just different. Maybe it's the same thing. The cold arrived in earnest on the 18th of November. I know the date because I wrote it down, not because I'm disciplined about dates generally, but because the cold that came that day was not the ordinary cold of the season. It was the kind that ranchers in this territory spoke about afterward for years, that got referenced in conversations as a marker. That was before the cold of 18, or after that bad November. It came in over 2 days like a presence moving in rather than a weather pattern moving through. The water in the yard froze solid in 4 hours one morning. Eli had been expecting it. Haspa had said something about the way the light was sitting on the mesa, and Eli had spent the previous week insulating the barn in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until the cold came and I understood what he'd been preparing for. He'd packed straw into every gap in the south wall. He'd moved the stove to a position he'd calculated rather than chosen, the exact point in the space where the heat would distribute most evenly across all the pens. He'd built a secondary windbreak out of scrap lumber on the north-facing side of the barn. He had stored, in the 3 weeks before the cold came, a quantity of dry wood that I had thought was excessive. It was not excessive. It was, it turned out, almost exactly sufficient. For 5 days, the temperature didn't rise above what would have killed every piglet in that barn inside of 48 hours without what Eli had built. The valley's cattle operations were losing animals. Garvey's remaining livestock, those he'd kept from his own operation, had 2 fatalities he told me about later, animals that had been healthy and adult and established on the property for 2 seasons. The cold didn't care about preparation. The cold cared about cold. Eli's barn held. On the 3rd day of the worst of it, Casper showed up at the property with his mother, who had come from somewhere east and was visiting him. A small, upright woman in a wool coat who walked into Eli's barn and looked at the 69 piglets in their pens with their cord systems and their straw nests and their wood stove warmth, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You've been doing the feeding schedule yourself." "With help," Eli said, and glanced at me. She looked at the cord system on the pen gate for a while. She tested it with one finger, understanding the color logic. "My aunt did something like this," she said. "With lambs, 30 years ago, people in her county thought she'd lost her mind." "Did she?" Eli said. "Did she what?" "Lose her mind." The woman looked at him with a complicated expression. "She outlasted 3 families on the farms around her, so I suppose it depends on how you're measuring. She stayed for 4 hours and fed 12 piglets without being asked. On the 5th day, the cold broke. The valley took a long breath. Everything that had survived it did the particular animal thing of reestablishing normalcy with suspicious speed. The horses came alert. The birds came back to the outbuildings. Even the dogs had a different quality to their bark. And in Eli's barn, 69 piglets with colored cords and wool scraps and opinions about feeding schedules pushed against their pen walls with the full, demanding vitality of animals that did not know they'd been in danger. I wrote in my log that evening, he was right, not in the smug way. In the quietest possible way, he was just right, and now we're all on the other side of it. What I did not yet know was what the other side looked like. What I didn't know was what happens to a community when it has called a man crazy and then discovered it was wrong, and whether that discovery brought people toward the man or further from him. I was about to find out. Written in the field log of Thomas Aldridge, December through February. Roy Fentress came on a Thursday. I know because Thursdays were when Haspa didn't come, and on Thursdays the property had a different texture, quieter in a way I'd grown to pay attention to, the way you notice a sound once it stops. So when I looked up from splitting wood and saw Roy's horse at the fence, I felt the wrongness of it specifically, and I stood and watched and did not move toward him or away. Roy was a big man, and the way men of that territory got big when they had authority and money and outdoor work for enough years, solid through the middle, heavy in the shoulders, with a face that had been organized by weather into a permanent expression of assessment. He wasn't unpleasant, I'd decided by that point. He was just a man who had never been wrong in his own estimation for long enough that the muscle memory of wrongness had atrophied. He sat on his horse at Eli's fence for a moment. Eli was on the other side of the barn and couldn't see him. I went and got Eli. Eli came out and stood at the fence and looked at Roy and said nothing. His breath made a long cloud in the December cold. Roy said, "Lost 14 calves in the cold stretch." Eli said, "I'm sorry to hear it." Roy's jaw tightened. "Heard your piglets came through it." "Most of them." A silence. Roy's horse stamped one foot. "I've got a situation," Roy said, and the words came out of him the way something comes out of a press with visible effort because of visible pressure behind them. "Got 11 calves that were born small, 2 weeks early. I've lost 3 of them already, and the vet says the others need more attention than we can give them, and they'll go the same way." Eli waited. "I'm asking," Roy said, "if you'd be willing to come out and look at them." "I'm not asking for anything else, just come look." The silence after that was the longest I heard on that property in the 4 months I spent there. A magpie went across the sky. The wind moved something loose on the barn roof. "I'll come tomorrow," Eli said. Roy nodded once. He looked at Eli with an expression I wrote down in my log that night as the face a man makes when he has spent a long time climbing up to something and has just arrived at the bottom of it instead of the top. Not shame exactly. Something more structural than shame. A rearrangement. He said, "Thank you." Eli went back into the barn. I stood at the fence and watched Roy ride out, and I thought, that's it. That's what it costs to be right in the quiet way. You have to be there when the people who were wrong come back, and you have to let them come back, and you have to do it without making them pay the toll. You have to decide, privately and without any audience to applaud it, that what matters is the thing and not the reckoning. I went back to splitting wood. What Eli found at Roy Fentress's operation the next day, I heard about from Casper, who was there. The 8 remaining small calves were in bad shape, thin, cold-stressed, disorganized in their feeding, 2 of them showing the shallow breathing that suggested they'd already been compromised by the cold stretch. Eli had walked among them the way he walked among his own piglets, without drama, with the specific attention that is almost physical, like he was reading them with his hands and his eyes simultaneously. He told Roy 4 things needed to change, and he told him how to change them. He talked to Roy's men, 3 of them, all experienced hands who'd been working cattle for years, and he told them the same things without hierarchy, without the particular tone men use when they are correcting other men in front of their employer. He told them like you tell a fellow traveler about a road condition. There's a bad stretch about 5 miles ahead. Here's how it's best navigated. 2 of Roy's men, Casper told me, had looked at each other with the expression of people who had been expecting to be lectured, and had instead received information. Eli had come back to his own property in the evening, and had not mentioned it. I heard all of this from Casper, who had taken to showing up at Eli's place regularly now. Not because Eli had invited him exactly, but because Eli had never told him to stop coming, and Casper was the kind of person who understood that this was, for Eli Rourke, functionally the same thing as an invitation. What happened over the next 6 weeks was the thing I have turned over in my mind the most, in the years since I left that property and went on to other work and other territories. What happened was so ordinary, looked at from the outside, that you could miss it entirely, which is maybe why it has stayed with me. Garvey came and asked Eli about his remaining sow's milk production, which had been poor since the sickness in September, and Eli sat with him at the kitchen table for an hour and talked through it. Two Hat came back twice, and on the second time he brought his brother who had a homestead further north and a different problem with his livestock entirely, and Eli looked at what the brother described and told him 2 things to try, and said if neither of them worked to come back. The brother came back, but only to report that the first thing had worked. Marta brought stew again, and this time she stayed and asked Eli directly what he'd used in the milk mixture. Eli told her. She wrote it down. She had, it turned out, a neighbor with sick goats and a neighbor's kid with a sick dog, and she was putting information together across a wider network than I'd realized, doing in the social world what Eli did in the barn, tracking what worked, applying it, tracking again. I watched all of this from the edges, the way I tend to watch things, writing it in my log because that is what I do with things I don't fully understand. What I was watching was a community reconstituting itself around a man it had previously dismissed, but reconstituting in a way that was, and this is the thing that mattered, not sycophantic. Nobody was performing contrition. Nobody was making speeches about having been wrong. They were simply doing what they did, which was practical and direct, and they were doing it by coming to Eli, and Eli was doing what he did, which was answering questions and working alongside people, and not making anyone explain why they'd arrived. Hasba watched all of this with the expression he had for most things, equanimous, alert, giving nothing away for free. I told him once, on a cold afternoon in January when we were the only 2 people on the property for an hour, that I found it remarkable, what was happening with the community, the way it had shifted. I said I didn't understand why Eli didn't seem to find any satisfaction in it. Hasba thought about this for longer than the question seemed to require. Then he said, "A man does a thing because it is the thing that needs doing. The community coming to understand this does not change what the thing was. It only changes the community." I wrote that in my log and stared at it for a while. Then I wrote underneath it, "I think I came to this property to repair someone else's fence, and I've spent 4 months being quietly repaired myself. I'm not sure that's what I was told would happen, but I am no longer certain I know what I was told." The piglets grew. By January, they were not piglets in any diminishing sense. They were pigs, loud and demanding and organized in their own way, shoving the hierarchy of the pen into whatever shape suited them that day, sleeping in heaps for warmth with a pragmatic physical closeness that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with understanding what they needed. Eli had begun talking to Two Hat and Garvey about the return arrangement. The farmers had given him the animals with the understanding that if they survived, some portion of them would come back. Eli had kept track. There were numbers agreed on. The conversations were straightforward and without drama. Peck, the third of the original farmers, had not come back to the property at all. I'd seen him once in town, and he'd been friendly enough in a guarded way, and I thought perhaps he was the kind of man who found the rearrangement too uncomfortable to sit with. But then in February, he showed up at Eli's fence with 2 of his kids, a boy about 10 and a girl younger, and he said he'd promised them they could see the pigs before they went back. Eli opened the fence without a word. The kids went into the barn, and the pigs were the pigs, enormous relative to the children's expectations. Loud, insistent, unimpressed. The girl reached through the pen slat and touched one on the nose, and it snorted, and she screamed with the pure joyful alarm of a child encountering something real. And even Eli made the sound that was almost a laugh. That thing his face did occasionally when reality exceeded whatever he'd been expecting. Peck watched his kids in the barn for a long time. Then he looked at Eli and said, "I'm glad they made it." Eli nodded. "I thought they wouldn't," Peck said. "When I gave them to you, I thought I was giving you a hard thing to carry." "You were," Eli said. Peck absorbed this. "I'm sorry for it." "You gave them to me instead of leaving them in the field," Eli said. "That's the part that mattered." And that was the conversation. And then they watched the kids with the pigs for another while. And then Peck and his kids left. And Eli stood at the fence after they'd gone with his hands on the top rail, and his face in the particular arrangement of a man who is not thinking about anything that can be put into words. I didn't write about it that night. I wrote about it 2 days later when I'd figured out what I wanted to say. What I wrote, the thing about being right when no one believes you is that being right doesn't erase the weight of the months when you're not yet proven right. You still carry those months. Nobody gives them back. And if the vindication eventually comes, it doesn't arrive like a gift. It arrives like a receipt for something you already paid for, and what you paid is still paid, and all the receipt tells you is that the payment went somewhere. Eli paid for those months. He paid in lost sleep and dead animals, and the specific exhaustion of caring about something in public when the public is looking at you sideways. The payment went to 69 pigs that survived a winter that killed cattle in established operations with experienced hands. The payment went to Roy Fentress's 8 calves that lived because someone knew what to do and was willing to come and do it. The payment went to Marta's neighbor's kid's dog and Two Hats' brother's livestock problem, and every quiet conversation at a kitchen table. I don't know if Eli thinks about it in those terms. Probably not. That's not how he's organized. But I'm organized that way, and I want someone to have counted it. I left the Rourke property in late February when my situation clarified. The outfit I'd originally been hired for had work again, and I needed the steadier wage. Eli shook my hand at the fence. He said, "You're a good hand, better than you came with." I didn't know if he meant better at the ranch work or better at something else. Knowing Eli, probably both. Haspa was there that morning, standing at the edge of the property in the way he stood when he was seeing something to a conclusion. He raised one hand when I rode past, not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, the particular gesture of someone marking a thing witnessed. I raised mine back. The morning I left was bright and sharp-edged the way February mornings are in that country, when the winter still has its teeth but the light has begun to remember what it's for. The pigs were loud. The barn was warm. The valley below the Rourke property spread out in all its cold, indifferent, specific beauty, and somewhere down in it Roy Fentress's 8 small calves were alive and eating, and Two Hats' brother's animals had stabilized, and Marta's neighbor's dog was, as far as I knew, still breathing. I rode out the gate and did not look back, because looking back is not a habit I've cultivated, but I held it in my mind. The image of the barn in the early light, the smoke from the stove rising straight up through no wind, the sound of the pigs carrying further than sound ought to carry in the cold. I carried it the way I carry things that matter, not by displaying it, but by returning to it when nothing else in the world is making sense. Eli's log had one more entry in it that I read before I left, dated the day before I rode out. He'd left it open again, which I had come to believe was not accidental. It said, "The season comes to what it comes to. I don't know what to make of any of it beyond what I can see. The animals are healthy. The people who came are welcome. The ones who didn't, they'll come when they come or they won't. Either way, the morning feeding is at 5 and the stove needs stoking and there's still work." I kept thinking this winter I'd reached the point where it felt like enough. I don't think that's how it works. I think it just keeps being the next thing. That's probably fine. I closed the log. I went and got my horse. The next thing was waiting, as it always is.